Hey everybody, I'm JC, and I'm here today to talk about mixing tracks for clubs. I think we've got all decided that we should mix maybe a dance track maybe differently than any other type of music. I tend to disagree with that. I've been mixing for about 30 years now, and I've started mixing dance music from the early 90s on big SSL desk and etc. And the way I've approached mixing was always the same way. For me, a mix comes with the style of the track. So different type of style dictate a different process and a different result. So if you mix hip-hop, you're going to want a slamming snare drum, a big fat kick, big fat bass. If you mix drum and bass, often you're going to have the kick drum higher than the bass because the bottom end, the sub bass, is going to have to be under. So it's all about different style. Again, if you do an underground track, it may require to be a bit raw and not so much processed. Whereas if you do an EDM track, for example, super polished and super processed, then you're going to have a lot more going on in your mix. So for me, mixing for club is about more understanding what it is, what the style, what the aesthetic of a mix should be for. So for me, the techniques mixing for club, it is the same as mixing any style. You're going to use compression, EQ, levels, pan, effects, all that kind of stuff. So the tools are exactly the same. But what do you need for club, for a track to work really well in a club environment? You're going to want to make sure you've got a nice and punchy, clear bottom end. That's going to work well on those big speaker sound system. You're going to make sure that you've got a balanced mix, no matter what it is, any genre. It's going to have to be balanced. That means your bottom end, your mids. You want the clear mid to be really much there, really present and clean. So one thing maybe that you need to consider more for club than any other style is your mix got to work in mono. Many clubs, especially nowadays, kind of modern clubs, are made of small rooms. So you may be at the bar to get a drink, you may go on the dance floor, then you may go somewhere else, have a chat, and you're going to have little sound system in all those different rooms. So if you have a mix that uses a lot of stereo, what I mean by a lot of stereo is maybe one part on one side, another part on the other side. Both of them are the main riff of the song. You may have a problem where you end up being in one room and you hear one song, and you go on to the other and you're not hearing the main riffs. So monocompatibility is a really big thing, in my opinion, for club. Also, as an exercise for mixing, if your mixing sounds great in mono, they're going to sound absolutely awesome in stereo. Because in mono, everything is fighting in the middle. So you need to work a little bit more in getting separation. Whereas as soon as you start panning things, you're leaving a lot of space. Suddenly in stereo, you're like, wow. So, like I was saying, in terms of the style of club, it's the same. There's so many different genres. If you go back in the early 90s, late 80s, early dance music, when it was underground and there was no budget and nobody really knew what was going on, a lot of those records were made at home on a small studio. If you think Daft Punk, first album, Homework, was mixed on a Mackie mixer, which is a 600-pound mixer. It was all about the production, about how it was put together. It was about the track. It wasn't so much, nobody was like, I'm not sure about the mix on that track. People embraced it because the music was great, it was exciting. Having said that, very much kind of like mid-90s, I did a lot of mixing for people like Frankie Fonset and Sasha. And by that time, we had reached a point where there was budget. People were buying remix. A lot of money were put into remixing, to the point where actually any single record in the pop world anywhere had 2 or 3 remixes. So we could afford to go in big studios. Suddenly we were mixing on SSL, studios that cost £1,000 a day. So that kind of changed the game. So it's important to bear that in mind when you approach your own mixing, what it is that you want to achieve. So in terms of starting the mix, here I've got a track from Revilo. It's one of our ex-students at Point Blank. And we signed the track, we liked it. We've got a label at Point Blank called Point Blank Music, and we loved the track so much, we decided to put it out. And he kindly gave us the mix, so I could play with it. I'm going to play you briefly the mix as he's given it to me. So that's the mix that Revilo gave me. What I like about that mix is that it's already sound there. Pretty much, as you can see on my mixer, every fader is at 0 dB, and it clearly has bounced everything, the stems for me, very nicely. I push all the faders on 0. The mix, it sounds pretty much there. Now, with electronic music, there's one thing to consider, is that I don't know how many of you guys, when you produce, do you mix as you produce? I think I've heard those discussions before, and I think most people do that. And it's probably the right way to do it, because you're shaping up the sound and you're building it up to the point where you're like, yeah, the track is sounding pretty nice now. So having said that, I don't know how many of you mix with all the MIDI and the virtual instruments, Contact, whatever it is that you're using. Personally, I like to put everything to audio at some stage, like it is here. I'm glad that Revilo gave us the track in that state. You see, everything is audio. There's two reasons why I think mixing from audio is better. You're saving CPU. If I had to have, let's say, battery for the drums, Contact for the bass, reactor somewhere, some synth, I'm already hitting the CPU pretty hard. On top of it, as we talked about, if you start mixing as you produce, you're probably already going to have lots of plugins as well. So by the time you're kind of in a mix situation, your computer is already pretty much strained with the CPU. So that's one reason I love to put everything in audio. The second reason is that once it's in audio, it's totally committed. And I think one of the problems nowadays when producing music in the box is that, I don't know about you guys, but I'm struggling to finish tracks, with a computer, because you're always thinking, I probably could change that. And halfway through the mix, you're like, shall I change the kick drum? Shall I change the clap? Oh, maybe I'm going to try a different bass line. And it's like, when are you finishing the song? When are you finishing the track? And I think committing to audio helps you toward that. You're kind of like, yeah, that's it, I'm going to live with it. And obviously, if you really hate it so much, at some stage, you're going to have to go back. But committing is really, really important, because I think many producers limit themselves so they can finish tracks. So that for me, is really, really important. In terms of organizing your mix, again, I'm so grateful that Revilo gave me the mix in that state. I never receive mixes like that, never. Most of the time, I tend to have to spend the entire day cleaning up so I can start mixing. So this one is really organized. It's even colored. So I've got all the drums at the top in green, some effects in red, synth in... it's perfect for me. I love that. I can get on with it straight away. You see it's working pretty well, to the point where I'm like, I probably, with a bit of mastering, probably could put it out that way. So what can we do to maybe improve a little bit on that track? So I'm going to close that session now, and I'm going to open that one, which is the one I've worked on. Normally, I would probably have a lot more plugins, but because that track was sounding so nice already, it was pretty much there, I felt there wasn't that much to do. And I think that's really important. There are so many people who suddenly feel, oh, I've got the plugin, I've got the latest plugin, I've heard this one is wicked, I've got to put it on. And it's like, well, do you really have to, just because you just bought it, or, whatever? So I'm trying to keep it to the minimal, because ultimately, if you have to do too much to your mix, maybe you should go back to the production and kind of fix the problems. There's one saying that every mix engineer says, you can't polish a turd. So, make sure it sounds absolutely brilliant to start with, and the mix is going to give you an extra 10, 20%. The mix, don't expect, it's about setting your expectation. You shouldn't expect the mix to suddenly make something average great. You should aim to make something great, fantastic. That's the plan. So more and more, I tend to start with the master bus. There's a reason behind it, and it comes from back in the days of analog world. If you start shaping the sound, if the mix like it was here was really nice to start with, it really works, there's no point starting to go on EQing, compressing every single element. What I'm going to end up doing is probably destroying what was working. There's a strong danger of that. So when you mix, I think it's important to kind of really acknowledge, I'm at a stage where it's working. That's my reference point. You don't want to go below that. You want to keep improving. So I start on the master bus, because that means I can shape the color, the tone of the mix, the attitude of the mix. And what it means is, back in the days of analog, if you put, let's say, bringing up a bit of brightening up the entire mix, usually, boosting a bit of top end over your mix. If you do that on the master bus, that means you're going to do less on every single channel. If I put, let's say, 15K plus 2 dB on the master bus, I'm probably not going to have to do as much on my hi-hat, on the vocals, on whatever, the synth, because it's already there and it kind of glues together. So I'm a big fan of that, and I would advise you to try. Think of it as almost like a pre-mastering type of approach, if you like. So I'm going to show you my main bus, the chain of plugins that I use, and obviously there are lots of alternatives. Every engineer has their own preferences. So I'm a big fan of this Wave plugin for a start. I don't know if any of you guys know that one, the NLS bus. And maybe what I'll do is switch them all off, so hopefully you can hear what it's doing. That plugin is quite subtle. What I do with it is, the idea is to emulate a mixing board. It's called nonlinear summing. One of the problems with digital is that what you give into, it gives you exactly the same. Back in the days of analog, you would send something, it could come back to you slightly different. That was due to imperfections of analog. But since then, we've realized there was something nice about it, something quite musical about it. And since then, we are back into kind of chasing our tails a little bit, trying to bring that kind of musicality in terms of sonic musicality, if you like. It emulates 3 different desks. Spike, who's a really famous mix engineer, and that's his SSL. Or Mike Hedges, another famous mix engineer, and it's an EMI vintage desk. If I play the difference, let me put it somewhere more relevant. The EMI desk sounds a bit different. The bottom end is different, the top end is different, so it has more that kind of hi-fi curve, if you like. And then you've got the Nevo. You had Nevo. He's a good friend. He's done a lot of work with us at Point Blank. He's an engineer, and he's got a customized Neve desk, and he develops a lot of plugins for Waves. It's a much more cleaner desk, maybe less color, if you like. I tend to put that on the master bus first thing, and after that, what you can do is start putting it on individual channel. And what it simulates is that kind of summing that happens on an analog desk. So I'm a big fan of that. The second thing I tend to do is put an SSL compressor. Now, it doesn't have to be an SSL. It can be an API. It could be a Vertigo. There's a lot of bus compressors for your entire mix. The SSL kind of is a classic in the sense that it kind of gives you that glue together. So now I'm bringing it together with that. Again, I'm doing very little, but all those little things add up together and becomes something hopefully much better. I've got to say I'm a big fan of the UAD plugin, and this one sounds so close to the original. And I tend to put a very slow attack and as fast result release as I can. That way you preserve the transient, the attack. Very important in dance music, the transient on the kick, on the snare, all those kind of elements that are percussive, that gives you the energy. So a slow attack means that the peak can go through and the compressors start to compress once the peak have gone through. It's one way to add punch to certain sound, works a treat on snares and kick drum. So you're going to see I'm doing a little bit of it. I'm going to take it off. Noticing slightly, starting to bring it a little bit more together. Maybe the low mid is starting to bring up a little bit. Really lovely. Again, I'm doing about 2 dB of reduction, so not much. When you go on the master mix, I wouldn't, or the same for mastering, I wouldn't start hammering too much because you're doing probably more likely to do more damage. If you want that kind of heavy compression, go back to your multi-track and do it on individual elements rather than the entire mix. The next thing that I'm doing, I was telling you about EQ. So I'm a big fan of that one. I don't know if any of you know the Manley Passive EQ, quite a posh, expensive EQ, about £3,000 probably as a hardware. But again, the simulation is absolutely awesome on that one. And what I do with it, as you're going to see, I'm almost doing a bit of what you would do on a hi-fi system, where you boost the top end, boost the bottom end. It gives you that kind of often at home you may do that, and often if I feel that I need to reach to that on the hi-fi, I may as well do it in the mix to start with. One way to get into that again. So here I'm boosting about 16K, is it? I can't see properly. Maybe 18. I'm doing a little bit of boost at 18, a little bit at 60. 60 hertz is a lovely posh frequency that gives you that kind of warm, really nice feeling. So now I've got it in. Let's have a listen. And I'm going to bypass the 3 so far. Starting to hear what it's doing. We're starting to get some improvement altogether here. Now, something else I tend to start doing a lot, I'm a big fan of harmonic distortion. You know, harmonic distortion is kind of like when you drive an amp or a line input, or it's basically slight distortion. Harmonic distortion is very useful when working in the box because it's starting to bring that warmth, and that's what I call natural compression, instead of hitting a compressor where you really hear once it has passed the threshold and you're starting to hit the compressor, you hear what it's doing. And sometimes that's what you want, but harmonic distortion usually brings a bit of compression. It's part of the process, it's intertwined. But also it can bring some low mid, bring some warmth. And for me, one of the main things, I don't know about you guys, but working in the box for a long time, I felt that mixing in the box wasn't really working for me because I didn't like the top end. I didn't like anything above 2-3K. I felt was a bit harsh and a bit too much like there, and I wanted to find a way to make that more pleasant. And all those new tools now, I think for the last 5 years now, the plugins have gone to the point where it's so good, you really can get very similar result that you would have mixing analog. This one is a black box. It's a kind of boutique hardware. Again, it cost about £3,000, $3,000 as a hardware. So quite an expensive distortion. But it's used a lot by mastering engineers, mixing engineers, and Plugin Alliance have done this simulation, which is absolutely awesome. It basically, to keep it very simple, you've got saturation, you've got 2 different types of valves doing the even harmonics, which are the more pleasant one, and odd harmonics, even harmonics, the one that's slightly more unpleasant, but a combination of both can really increase the level, what is we know as perceived loudness, for the same peak level. And as you know, probably guys, one of the game at the moment when mixing and mastering, it's all about getting that kind of level. And if you produce a track and you mix it yourself, master it quickly, and are you all DJs as well as producing? All of you who produce are DJs as well? So often you may do a track in the afternoon, finish it, and you can't wait to play it in the evenings. The last thing you want is suddenly your mix to sound like that compared to other commercially released tracks. So although it's a mastering subject, and I won't go too much into it, I really believe the kind of perceived loudness to increase the overall loudness starts at the mixing stage with subtle compression. That means at the mastering, you don't have to hit the limiter so hard, because limiter is what really degrades the quality of music and kills your transient and your punch. And you want punch, it's important. So let's have a listen what I've done here with that. Notice the small jump here. Without. I'm absolutely falling in love with that plugin. I'm becoming that one of my first go-to plugins now. It has air amount, again bringing a bit of top end, making that mix clearer and punchier. The pentode and triode valve are starting to bring you that kind of excitement, but without being overly excited to the point where, I don't know about you, but sometimes you're going to have to go to a club where the sound system may not be as good. Some club systems are brilliant in some clubs, and other club systems are maybe not so good. And for me, the worse the club system is, the mixes can sound really harsh and really kind of like take your ears off, and you're like, I've got to leave that room now. So one of the things I find with mixing for club, it's really important to try to keep not only the punch while maintaining some warmth, because then you can really play it loud and still being quite nice, whereas if it's too harsh, as soon as you play it too hard, you're like, that's it, I'm done, my ears are gone. So all those little techniques that I'm discussing with you, I think really helps towards achieving that kind of warm sound, but still keeping the punch etc. Finally, on my master bus, I have this. Again, it's a UAD, it's a tape machine. That is the classic tape machine that pretty much most records throughout the 90s were mixed onto. A lot of the classic house and stuff, you would have those machines because there was no choice. That was, you had to print your mix. You know, nowadays we bounce. You know, you click the bounce button and you get a nice audio file. But back in the days, you had to put to a tape machine, and that would go to the mastering engineer who would, you know, prepare for vinyl or CD. This simulation is lovely again, and it's another way to achieve what we've been discussing, non-linear kind of aspect of mixing. What I love about analog is that if you put 10K at that level, with some analog equipment, the 10K is going to be kind of slightly curved. It's going to give you a more pleasant. So it's another way to deal with what I would call digititis, which is the bad aspect of digital that makes you hear, you know, go a bit crazy. But also tape is known as a compression. I don't know if any of you know about tape compression, or you may have heard of it. Tape, as soon as you start hitting tape, it creates a bit of compression on your bottom end and across the whole range, but especially the bottom end. So it's another way to help towards this perceived loudness, getting a louder mix, but getting it still keeping the warmth, everything under control. So let's have a listen now that we've got all that all this chain. And I'm gonna take it all off. That's without. You notice the difference. It's more punchy, it's a bit louder. I'm still getting the same level, but it, in my opinion, sounds a lot better. It's starting to sound like a record. A couple of other things just to make you aware of that I use a lot on the master bus is, one of them is that one. I don't know if any of you know that Magic AB from Sample Magic. It's basically, when you mix, I don't know about you, but when I mix, I like to have a reference at some stage to check other track commercially released. So I've got something to, am I in the right ballpark? Am I doing okay? Is it sounding like a record, basically? Or am I still far away from what it should sound like? This plugin allows you to load 9 songs with any cue point. And literally, A is your mix, B is whatever audio file that you've loaded into it. I mean, it's such a useful tool. I've always wanted one like that. And as soon as it came out, I was like, yeah, prayers have been answered. Here, I'm going to play that track here, put it. If I bypass it, nothing's going to happen. So that's the original mix. Let me stop it. Bring that here. Oh, yeah, it's on sync, so I'm going to have it here. That's the original mix when everything was on 0. And that's where we are now. So we've got pretty much the same peak, but we've gone much louder already. So it's kind of a pre-mastering kind of job. But this is the kind of stuff you can really achieve with subtle changes on the overall mix bus. Another thing that may be useful to you, I always get that question, how loud my mix should be. Those kind of questions. There's this theory about 6 dB, hitting 6 dB of headroom when you finish your mix and send it for mastering. I think the key is it doesn't peak, it doesn't go over 0. And sometimes there are very short peaks. When you get, let's say, if your mix hit -1 dB, -2 dB, you may have some accidental peaks that are going to go over 0 that your normal metering won't pick up. They're known as intersample peak, for example, or true peak. So the 6 dB theory realistically is to make sure that you don't go over 0. What you don't want is send the mastering engineer a track that is clipping effectively. You know. So 6 dB is safe, but I would say 3 dB is going to work as well, as long as you don't peak. This metering tool is really useful. It gives you headroom. not 6 dB headroom, it's 3.2, but it's still okay, as long as I'm not going over 0. Another thing that is useful with that plugin is you can check the stereo field, and I'm going to get into that in a second about the mono that we've talked about. But you can check it here. So you see, that indicates that most of the stuff happens in the middle, and the thing on the side is your phase, the relationship between left and right. You should be worried when that goes below, when it goes negative. That means you've got a major phase problem. So again, a no-go. Phase problem means problem with bass, not as round, not as clear, not as punchy, and to the extreme where if you've got a major bass problem, you won't be able to put it to vinyl. And I know vinyl is becoming a thing again, so maybe something to think about. Finally, here I've got the dynamic range. Dynamic range is the level between the quietest and the louder. One of the problems with modern mastering, where everything is super loud, it's not so much that it's super loud, it's the fact that to achieve that loudness, you're reducing the dynamic range. What it means is that even the quieter beats are really loud, and the louder beats are a little bit louder, but not that much. That, for me, creates a problem, because you don't have impact anymore. You know, let's say you're coming from the intro, and you're hitting the big part of the song, and you're getting a little jump. I'm not sure it's that effective. What you want is feeling a big jump, so when you're kicking in, yes, now we're in. Another thing that I love about that plugin, I'll go back here, is you can listen in mono. So we talked about it, I've already mentioned. Now, let's have a listen in mono. So I'm quite happy with how it sounds in mono, because you're not getting a massive, suddenly the mix is completely changing. You know, and that can happen sometimes. And if the change is too radical between stereo and mono, then those problems that we've discussed earlier on about being in one part of the room and another part of the room will happen. Whereas here, I'm quite confident that wherever I am, I'm getting what it should be. When listening in mono, something that not everybody knows about, I guess, is it's quite useful to listen only to one side. Instead of using to left and right together in mono, listen to only one side in mono, and you can do that with that plugin. So you see here on my fader, where is it? Oh yeah. I'm only listening to the left-hand side. It's obviously quieter, it's normal, but again, I'm not getting something completely different. I'm like, whoa, I'm not freaking out, everything is cool. Finally, on this mixing, there's something really nice, which is bass space. One thing about dance music which is very important is obviously getting your bottom end right, because you're in a club, big sound system. You want to make sure the kick and the bass, because that's what makes you dance. That's what drives for certain genre of dance anyway. So you need to achieve a clean bottom end. And the way to do that is to make sure that there's nothing that gets in the way of the kick and the bass. So this plugin, they've designed something which is pretty cool. You basically mute the bass, mute the kick. As soon as I'm going to find them, yeah, I've got them here. And now I'm going to listen to it, and I'm going to put... You see, it gives you those frequencies. Absolutely nothing. I'm getting 40, 80, 120, 160. If that starts to go in the red, that means you already have too many things happening in those frequencies, and they're probably going to start creating problem with your bass and your kick. Now, the more experienced you are, the more you've trained your ears, you will pick on that. But when you start, you're a beginner, it may be quite useful to check. You know, it's one way to kind of like, okay, I'm in the right direction. And especially at home, if you work on small speakers, sometimes you don't hear everything. They don't translate that well, especially in what's going on, you know, below 160 hertz. I've showed you the master bus, which on that mix particularly was the most important. But there are other things that I wanted to really discuss with you today. One of them is compression, and everybody's kind of like, oh, as soon as I put compression, it's going to sound fatter. And it's kind of like, well, it doesn't quite work like that, compression, does it? So what I wanted to illustrate to you guys is on a kick drum. Compression is to control the dynamic of a sound, yeah? So if you have a real instrument, let's say a bass player, and he plays 3 notes, he may play them at different level just because he doesn't hit as hard, or same with a real drummer. So you try to compensate that with a compression a little bit. It's one of the aim of using a compressor. Same on vocal. The vocalist may move away from the mic. You'll start to try to compensate for the movement of the mic or singing quieter. But with electronic music, when everything is programmed, you don't really need to control dynamic, because if you need a sound that is quieter, you just bring the MIDI down and it's quieter. That's what I mean by getting your production right. You know, you produce everything and it sounds right. So why do we use compression, in electronic music, on electronic sound? There's 2 reasons. To control the bottom end. We all want a track that sounds super fat in club. However, and I'm not going to go into the theory of acoustic, but the lower the frequency, the longer is the wave form. Yeah? A wave is a physical thing that we don't see, but it's there. Stand in front of a PA, you're going to feel those vibrations. The low end, it's going to make your tummy go funny. That's, well, you know, the bottom end does that to you because the waves are longer. So you want to control that in a way that it's tight. It's fat, but it's tight. If it's not tight, then you're going to have this kind of rumble going on, and that's what you want to avoid. So compression can help you having those fat, low sub, but at some stage you tell them, you stop here. You know, I let you go for a while, but after that you stop here, you're control, you're in a, you know. So it can help, compression can do that for your bottom end, but it also can shape the sound in the sense that compression is going to change the transient, going to change the front and end of your sound, especially the front, very much so. So you may be in a situation where if you want more attack, putting compression with a slow attack is going to emphasize the attack of a kick drum or a snare drum. If you've got too much click, too much front on the kick drum, you may want to put a fast attack and suddenly keep it under control a little bit more. So let me demonstrate that on the kick drum here. Main kick drum, yeah. Do you hear what it's doing to the kick drum now? What I've done here on the kick drum, I wanted to get more, so I've used EQ because I wanted to get a bit more attack, but I've used compressor with a fast, with a slow attack, pardon me. So I'm gonna maybe increase that. I'm gonna put a fast attack now. Are you noticing how much it's compressing it, how much it's boom, straight away. It's taking the sound and it's boom, keeping it there straight away. Whereas with a slow attack, it's kind of leave the initial part of the sound go through, and then it's capturing it. That way, I'm able to emphasize the attack of the click, but also making sure the bottom end is still there, controlled. One of the questions we get a lot at Point Blank from students is, should I put my EQ or compressor first? Who should come first? Totally different type of ways to go about it. Typically, I tend to put compressor first, but in dance music, sometimes you want to start exaggerating, making the bottom end a bit stronger, almost like I would say overdo it. So I tend to boost, and you will notice here I'm boosting 50 hertz on my EQ. Can you see, guys? So I'm boosting 50 hertz here. I'm also dipping at about 200, which is where the muddiness can happen. There was a bit of a nasty resonance in there. So I just dipped a little bit. I'm getting a cleaner kick now. That's without. Let me put back into the track. Just felt there was a bit of resonance on the low mid, which maybe in some club it's not going to translate really well. See, it's cleaner. It's got more punch. It's fat, but it's still controlled. So that's what I'm achieving here. So what I've done here, I've put the EQ first and the compressor afterwards. So I'm sending those, I'm boosting this low end, but then I'm going into the compressor and I'm saying to this low end, yeah, you're there, but I'm keeping you there under control rather than let you go wild into the speakers. You shouldn't aim to completely radically change it. If you're not happy with your kick drum, then go back to your production and change the kick drum to start with. But in that case, I was happy with the kick drums that the producer brought into the track. I just wanted it to fit slightly differently with everything else I had done. So I've shaped it a little bit. And there's a big difference between shaping a little bit to suddenly change it radically. If you want to change it radically, don't do it with EQ, with compression. Go back and change your kick drum. Here, I also have a clap. So I've done something on the clap here. And I've done a similar thing, except that this one, I've put a fast attack. That's the original clap. Oh, let's go back to where it plays. The problem I had with that clap was a little bit what we talked about, on a sound system that may be a little bit harsh. That, for me, was starting to be a little bit over the top. So I wanted to keep that under control, still keep it nice and punchy, but just make that a little bit more pleasant. I've done that. See, without, a bit attenuated. So what I've done with that is a fast attack. The compressor kind of pulled a bit quicker on it. I've made a little bit more warm, so I've added 1K. 1K is not harsh, 1K is still fairly warm. It gives you that kind of bite. It gives you attack, but without being really fierce and painful to the ears. And then I've made a lot of space, like a low cut or high-pass filter at about 100, just to make sure it wasn't in the way of anything else, because there was just a bit there. And I think it works better. So on the drums, you would see I've done very little, just that. The one thing on drums that I've done, I've put it into a bus. I always bus my drums all together. Again, I'm trying to get that sense of togetherness. And I've put a tiny compressor on the overall drum. This time round, I didn't use an SSL, I've used the API. The API is known as a compressor to be quite punchy. It's an American design, and they're really, really nice. So let's have a listen to what it does here on our track. I think we can go a bit more on that. Again, quite subtle, but they're becoming just a tad more tight together. And again, like I was saying, I love the idea of doing a little bit every step of the way until you get something that's starting to sound like a record. But I think it's important to start learning the tools. I think about mixing, it's about developing your critical listening skills and understanding. It can be overwhelming nowadays because very quickly you just go online, buy a bunch of plugins, and suddenly you've got, wow, all the tools that professional engineers had for 20 years for, a few £100. But you end up with all those tools and you don't take time to learn them. And for me, it's really about learning them. I'm getting to the stage where now I feel a bit more comfortable with, I know how 1176 sound, an LA2A, an SSL compressor. Therefore, depending on what it is that I'm after, I can make the right choice of compression. Because a lot of it is about choosing the right tools, which can be difficult when you're starting and you have all those tools at once. So I think if you can spend some time, when you don't make music, even just play about with some compressors, send some music into it and see what they do. And you're going to start learning how they work and appreciate. And then back into your music, you'll be like, I'm going to try that because that's probably going to give me that, you're getting to the stage where you almost know what you're after and what's going to happen. It's a good place to be. So that's for my drum. Then bass. Bass is probably on that track where I've done the most. I don't know if you know Plugin Alliance. I've showed you the black design before, the analog box. The BX Control is a great tool that allows you to make mono certain things. So here on the bass, I really wanted my bottom end to be mono. That, for me, was vital. So I've put it really high because the bass was quite stereo. I mean, let me bring that down. And no, here. You see the bass here? If you look at the red, it's the balance between left and right. You can see it's moving left and right a little bit. The bass is stereo, effectively. So I thought I could make the channel mono altogether, and therefore I wouldn't have problem. But the nature of that bass, it has a bit of high stuff in it as well. And I thought I'd like to keep that stereo. So what I wanted almost that kind of inverted triangle shape for my bass. So the bottom end, the low end, really mono. But then I'm quite happy to have stuff on the higher frequency to move about and give me a bit of space, because it's not going to have a huge effect, but it's going to feel a little bit more stereo. So what I ended up doing is put a mono maker here, a bit higher, about 7. Normally I wouldn't go that high, but for this example I wanted to illustrate to you guys. And then I've put some stereo width. So what the stereo width does is the top end is, I made it wider, and the low end I've made it narrower, like literally mono. So let's have a listen. So you see now the red meter is hardly moving anymore because the bottom end is there in the middle, but I've still kept the stereo. If you listen on headphones, you're still going to get the information left and right. So I've started with that. Then the bass, like I've said, it's a big part, obviously, of dance or club music in general, no matter what. So you're going to spend a lot of time. Without anything, maybe I should start playing it without anything, actually, guys. And I felt it was still moving a little bit. It wasn't really tight. Some of the notes were jumping out and etc. So I really wanted something like really super solid for that. So I used, again, another tape machine. This one is the 20 multi-track to the Classic Studio. Again, what I've done here is I'm using it at 15 IPS. The concept of tape, and I'm not going to give you a full lesson on tape machine, because we could be all there for the entire weekend, but it's the slower a tape runs at, the more compression you're getting. That's the idea. The downside of it is you're getting more hiss as well. But with digital, we don't care. We can get rid of the hiss if you need to. So it works out okay. Also, the more you send into it, the more kind of harmonic distortion you're getting, and the more compression you're getting. So this time around, I'm running that one at 15 IPS, and I'm driving the signal quite hot. It's not that hot, actually. You could go a lot more. Yeah. You see how some of the notes, the lower notes, how much they're hitting? So it allows me to even things out a little bit. The low note was just jumping out, and the higher note were disappearing a little bit. So it's one way. Tape machine is great. It's, again, what I call natural compression, rather than hitting a compressor. It does it in a more musical way, in my opinion. Next. And basically, what I've done with the tape here already is basically, have you noticed I haven't used any EQ? Because one way to also even out notes in a bass line is to, each note has a frequency known as the fundamental or the harmonic, and you can EQ down or up, and therefore you could almost rebalance certain bass notes. But here, because the tape is doing it for me, I'm like, well, if I don't have to put an EQ, I'm not going to put one just for the sake of it. Another compressor that I absolutely love for bass, and it's one of the most used compressor for bass, is this LA2A Teletronics. And UAD, I've done like 3 versions of them, and they all sound completely different. And what I was saying to you about learn your plugins is that, for example, especially with vocals, you'll see the 3 different models completely works in a different way. The top end's going to sound different. So I've tried the 3 of them on the bass, and I felt that one was really nice. So again, I'm getting like proper compression again, and hitting about 3-4 dB reduction at the most. You're starting to notice how it sounds really even now. It's solid. And then, when I say I didn't put EQ, actually I did after that. Because once I had all this work done, I thought, we still can do a little bit more on that bass. I've put another compression, this time the SSL. The SSL is kind of VCA, whereas the one before was optical compression. They all work differently. The optical is slower, the VCA is more transparent, but the optical gave me a lot of color and warmth. So again, it's about knowing your plugins, what they give you. The SSL is a bit more transparent, but I wanted something that, to finish my chain of plugins, I wanted to keep it clean and make sure it was really staying there and not going anywhere in terms of notes. Also, I thought the high frequency or high mid of that bass sound had gone a little bit in the track. Because here I'm soloing with you guys, but when you work, you should really not EQ too much while in solo. Because what you do in solo is make it work for what it is. But then you put everything in, and then it's kind of like, oh, it's not there anymore. So once I had the whole track going, I realized that maybe I was not getting as much of the bass was only down there, not. So I thought, let's bring a bit of that. You hear? We're getting the attack, the click of the bass a little bit more coming through once the full track is on. So again, you notice the little stages of stuff that I've done to get to where I wanted to be. One thing I've noticed on that track was that everything was bounced with effects. So I've tried playing with a couple of reverbs and stuff, and I was like, well, there's not really a need because it's already been there in the first place. So I kept it quite dry, except there was a couple of sounds. Here it is. I thought these sounds, the pad, could be a bit more interesting, just mildly, not saying, you know, that's without the effect I've put on. Notice it's becoming warmer, it's becoming a bit wider, and what I've used for that, it's a Roland classic piece of kit called the Dimension D Original. It's got 4 buttons. I love simple devices that do one thing really well. I absolutely love. So I use this mode, pressing button 3 and 4 together. It's basically a slight chorus modulation, so that gives you a wider sound, but it's got a lovely tone. I've used that on the pads and a couple of other synths. Again, that way to do things, I do it in parallel. I would have done via a send, post-fader, going back, and then you mix both, the original sound and the effect together. So I tend to do my effects like that instead of as an insert. I feel I've got more control. If I wanted, I could EQ my modulation. I could put a delay, a reverb on it. So I love parallel all my effects. I tend to keep them that way. So I think that's pretty much me going over the mix process for club. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, guys, happy to go to the stage.